This game is a light squared Symphony played by Alireza Firouzja in round 17 of the World Blitz Championship 2021. It was played against Mahammad Muradli, and we saw this Sicilian on board with Firouzja playing white here. And what we're going to see is a beautiful harmony of the pieces around this critical d5 square. So we had these opening moves being played, a standard open Sicilian, and black goes in for the Najdorf variation. And now Firouzja plays an unusual move here, pawn to a4. More normal is something like bishop to e3 or bishop to g5. There are many moves, of course, but pawn to a4 is slightly unusual at this stage. And now we had e5 from black. Black can play with e6 here. Again, there's lots of moves, but black goes for e5 instead, immediately striking at the centre and pushing this knight away. So you gain space and you gain time, and you will get some free and easy development of the pieces and play on the queen side in compensation for this backwards pawn. But what you give up here is this key d5 square. That's now a weakness in the position, and Firouzja immediately plays bishop to g5 here after black develops with bishop to e7. So white wants to chop bishop for knight to gain more control over this square, and when you start to understand that strategic objective, the moves of both players make sense here. So we had bishop to e6 now. You wouldn't want to come to g4 and swap for this knight. You have to keep an eye on this square. Now we had the immediate bishop takes on f6. So the reason white does this straight away is that if you go, say, bishop to e2, well, now black can go knight b to d7, and now you can recapture with the knight if white takes there. So that's why white takes immediately, displacing this bishop to f6, and now knight to d5, immediately occupying this square. And after black develops the knight to d7, we had bishop to c4, more eyeing of this key square. And here black actually castles, although just coming back a move, knight b6 could have been considered here. Again, fighting for this key square immediately, also hitting this bishop. So white may have had to take here. There are some options, but probably this is best. Queen would recapture. The bishop could then take here, doubling the black pawns, but in compensation for that structural weakness, you've taken away the d5 square, and you will have some long-term pressure down on the queen side here. But black didn't go for this. Black went for castles straight away here, but now Firouzja gets pawn to a5, taking away that jump from the knight and taking away that option altogether. And what we'll see now after rook to c8, queen to e2, is that white just has a really nice grip on the light squares here, which is very hard for black to shake. So black goes bishop to e7 here, trying to bring this knight into f6 and challenging that one, but probably better would have actually been activating this rook immediately. So you want to bring it to c5, but not straight away, because then you're running into b4 and you have to give ground. But if you had first taken this knight with the bishop, then the bishop recaptures, and now gone rook to c5, this is a much more harmonious setup for black, because you're preparing to bring the queen to c7, where it sits behind the rook rather than in front of it. You'll have pressure against this pawn from both of these pieces, pressure against the c2 pawn, and if white tries to play pawn to b4 in this position, well, now there's a really nice tactic with rook takes bishop here, because after pawn recaptures, you can play pawn to e4, and you're hitting both of these pieces like this, as we can see. But instead of playing like this, black played with the immediate bishop to e7 here, clearing the way for the knight to come to f6, and after castles, knight f6, Firouzja achieves rook to d1 here, and this is the difference between the variations. White's now just got so much more time. So the knight took on d5, the bishop recaptured, and now the queen went to c7, a less harmonious way to align the pieces, because after the pawn comes to c3 here to respond to that threat, black now goes rook to b8 because he can't find work for that rook on the c-file. He's preparing this b-pawn push, but again it gives Firouzja lots of time, so he goes knight to e1 now, improving his worst piece, which was staring at squares which it couldn't jump to. Really instructive play. And now pawn to b6 breaking. Pawn now captures, queen retakes, and now pawn to b4, dealing with this weakness. Queen to b5 now, trying to get these off the board, and you don't really want to take here as white, because after recaptures, although you can bring the rook to the 7th here, after rook f to e8 defending, black's going to have some long-term counterplay against this backwards c-pawn, so you don't want to give these chances. And instead, Firouzja correctly keeps the queens on the board by playing queen to a2 here. So he's double attacking e6, and that's why the bishops now get exchanged. The rook recaptures, the queen drops back, and now we have queen to b3 defending this pawn. Rook to c8 attacks it for a second time, rook to a3 defends it, and now a5 from black. If you take with the rook, then this one's dropping. If you take with the pawn, then your queen's dropping. But instead of this, Firouzja plays the accurate move, pawn to b5, hitting that queen. And this is where black had the last chance to try and keep in the game, which is by playing queen to c4 here, coming onto these light squares, trying to break that light squared grip and stopping this pawn from advancing down the board. But because the black queen dropped into here, now Firouzja just has a free hand to dominate the position. So the knight hopped in like this. Black prepared to double the rooks on the c-file. The knight came back, the rooks doubled, but pawn to c4 now. And look at this beautiful light squared grip here, just the harmony of the pieces. Pawn to g7 from black, there's very little else to do. Pawn to g3 from white, king to g7, and it should be noted if you try rook to c5 to exchange these ones off, well then knight to a4 comes and you're forking these, not what you want. So king to g7, queen to c3 now hitting this pawn, rook to a7 defends, knight to a4 hits the queen, that one drops back, and now pawn to b6, steamrolling down the board, and there's really very little black can do now. So rook to b3 here from white, bishop to d8 hits that pawn again, and rook d to b5, just coming to that file, protecting the pawn and preparing to push this one at the right moment. King to g8 now from black, they continue shuffling. Again, if you go rook to c6 to try and win this pawn, well you can't actually do so, because after say queen to d3, preparing to come in here as we saw in the game, you can't actually take this pawn because you're walking into a pin along this file which can't be broken. Queen to b1 is already a good move here, or you can even play king to g2 first to avoid any bishop takes with check, and then after say queen to c7, queen to b1, you're winning a piece, either this one or this one, depending what black gives up. So that's why you can't actually win this pawn on b6, and instead black just drops the king back. We had queen to d3, king to g7, queen to d5, king to g8, king to g2. Look at all these pieces on light squares, really beautiful to see. King to g7 and now pawn to c5. The breakthrough comes when all pieces are in their optimal positions. The pawn captures, the knight takes back, hitting the rook. This one moves away. Again, you can't take because after takes, if the bishop recaptures, now you're running into knight d7 with big problems. So that's why the rook moved away after knight c5. And now we had pawn to b7. Black gave up this exchange, the rook recaptured, and that was the final move of the game. Rook to c8 is coming. If you try and block with something like this, well then you take here with check. If you go with the bishop, you can take, and there's just all sorts of problems here and here. The game's completely over. So in this position, Firouzja won another game. If you enjoyed this one, then do hit here to subscribe, and see another amazing Firouzja game, click here. Thanks very much for watching, and see you soon.